und wir bleiben in der Sahara, also nicht nur temperaturtechnisch, auch thematisch. Es geht nämlich weiter mit dem Dokumentarfilmproduzenten Jack Kelley aus den USA. Er ist bekannt für seinen Dokumentarfilm The Atlantis Puzzle, welches 2024 veröffentlicht wurde. Und ich freue mich sehr auf seinen Vortrag, wie die grüne Sahara Atlantis und zahlreiche weitere Phänomene erklärt. Jack Kelley, herzlich willkommen.
Before I begin, I'd just like this audience to know that I respect you, and I actually had packed a three-piece suit to give this presentation because when I was packing my bags 3 weeks ago for this trip to Europe, they said the forecast was 24 degrees Celsius. And so if we can't figure out what the temperature is going to be in 3 weeks, how do we know what it's going to be in 300 years? Just a precursor to the presentation. Okay, so today, how Plato's Atlantis and the Green Sahara explain each other and many other things. I am not a climate scientist. I'm not a geophysicist. I'm not a paleoclimatologist. I'm a filmmaker and an author who, about 7 years ago, was handed a book about an ancient mystery in a hotel lobby and never quite recovered. In 2019, I was on the Greek island of Santorini, about to visit the ancient buried city of Akrotiri. While I was waiting for a taxi in our hotel, my then fiancée, now my wife, was browsing a bookshelf in the lobby. She handed me a book called The Atlantis Hypothesis, 2008, that included 2 papers by a Greek author named George Serentidis. In that instant, my life took a hard turn toward a wild journey of exploration. 5 years later, I released a documentary called The Atlantis Puzzle, and last year followed that up with a much more in-depth book by the same name. Today, I want to share with you what that journey of exploration has taught me and why I believe it's relevant to the conversation taking place at this conference. So, what does an ancient Greek myth have to do with climate? The short answer is that when you read what Plato actually wrote about Atlantis, not a Victorian-era translation, but the ancient Greek itself, and when you compare it to what we now know about North Africa 10 or 12,000 years ago, the two stories begin to explain each other. The myth describes a real climate. The climate makes sense of the myth. While that is quite a story within itself, there's an even more important story beyond that. What the journey from myth to ancient climate reality taught me about how we know what we think we know. Like the visible part of an iceberg, don't worry, we'll only hit the high points today. So, the translation that hid a continent. Maybe everybody is not familiar with this, but the Atlantis story comes to us from 2 of Plato's late dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, written around 360 BC. In them, a character named Critias tells a story he says was passed down from his great-grandfather, who heard it from the Athenian statesman Solon, who in turn originally heard it from priests at the Temple of Sais in Egypt. That was around 600 BC. According to the tale, 9,000 years before Solon's visit, or around 9,600 BC, there existed a powerful empire called Atlantis that waged war on North Africa and the Mediterranean world, and whose capital city was finally destroyed in a single day and night by earthquakes and floods. There's Solon, and here we have Ignatius Donnelly. For most of the modern era, every major translation of the ancient Greek has placed Atlantis somewhere way out in the Atlantic Ocean, an island continent reached by sailing west past the Pillars of Hercules into the open sea. The 1882 bestseller by Ignatius Donnelly, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, fixed this picture in the popular imagination for the next century and a half. What George Serentakis realized in revisiting this tale during his work on Plato's mythology is that this modern picture of Atlantis rests on a single mistranslated word. Seafaring was a dominant way of life for the ancient Greeks. They had specific vocabulary for different bodies of water. In much the same way, English distinguishes a stream from a river or a pond from a lake. What in English is called the Black Sea, the ancient Greeks referred to as the Euxenos Pontos, which means something like the brackish sea friendly to strangers. This is different from a thalassa, which was the term used for the Mediterranean Sea in Plato's era, and a pelagos is a smaller sea, usually partially enclosed by land. That word is still used today by modern Greeks to refer to bodies of water such as the Aegean Sea. As for the great open ocean that the Greeks believed surrounded the entire known world, that was called the Okeanos. And here you can see a depiction of what the Greek known world looked like. So the distinctions among and between these terms matter because I promise you Plato knew the difference. Here you can see example passages from two of his dialogues that demonstrate his different word choices. In the Phaedo, he uses Okeanos to describe the great encircling ocean, the world sea. But in the Timaeus and Critias, the dialogues where Atlantis is described, he never uses Okeanos to describe the bodies of water in question. He uses pelagos. To reach Atlantis from Greece, in Plato's original text, one does not cross the Atlantic Ocean. One crosses the Atlantic Pelagos. That's a sea bordered by land connected to the Mediterranean. When the 19th century translators came to this passage, they took Atlantic Pelagos to mean Atlantic Ocean. It is not hard to understand why. Have you ever heard of an Atlantic Sea? Neither had I, and neither had they. They also conveniently ignored clues, such as the fact Plato describes the entrance to this mysterious Atlantic Pelagos Sea as having silted up in his own era, but as having been previously navigable 9,000 years before that time. This disqualifies the entrance to the Atlantic Ocean at the Strait of Gibraltar because it's always been navigable during the ancient Greek era, and furthermore, that opening has not closed up for at least 5 million years. The translators simply assumed that the geography Plato described must conform to the geography that they knew. A more static picture of the world's climate, which has since been proven wrong many times over. And so for 150 years, the Western world looked for a sunken continent, which is also a mistranslation, called Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean, prompting all sorts of crazy ideas. Here you have a diagram, schematic of George Serentakis' work outlining the geography of Atlantis based on the Platonic dialogues. Now, when I first read Serentakis' work, my reaction was, this is an extremely interesting set of facts. But if I was about to stake my professional reputation on making a documentary about Atlantis, I had to be sure I had the full picture. Beyond understanding Platonic texts and Serentakis' nuanced arguments, I had to understand the ancient environment during the time frame of the story, circa 9600 BC. So I went looking for evidence that would either confirm or destroy Serentinus's reading. I began interviewing experts and reading every scientific paper I could get my hands on about the world at the dawn of the Holocene. Here's just a taste of what I was able to confirm. There was, in fact, a body of water that fits Plato's description of the Atlantic Pelagos. Today, this dried-out lakebed is dotted with smaller salt lakes called shots, which are strung across Tunisia and Algeria. But 12,000 years ago, the entire region was filled with water. It emptied into the Mediterranean Sea through what is now the Gulf of Gabes. This is a vast area fed by rivers and waterways that reached deep into the interior of Africa. Scientists now refer to this vanished body of water as the Shots megalake. There you have your Atlantic Pelagos, a body of water silted up in Plato's era that had once been navigable in the distant past. In my documentary film and book, I've explored many other facts which support Serentinus's reading, and I encourage those of you who are interested to investigate that further. So, what does this mean? Well, Plato described the prehistoric civilization of Atlantis as existing beyond a partially enclosed sea that empties into the Mediterranean, in a land of rivers, lakes, and fertile plains. And at the time of the myth's events, circa 9600 BC, there really was this kind of landscape in northwest Africa. Here you can see the Platonic schematic geography overlaid with a map of the Green Sahara. Now, this does not prove that the Atlantis story is literally true. There are many aspects of the myth which are demonstrably false, but it proves, I think, something more interesting. It proves that the geography of the myth was a real place, and if the setting was real, then the question is no longer, was the story all an invention? The question becomes, how much of the story might have a basis in truth? So, if the geography of Plato's myth was a real place, and utterly unlike the environment we see today, well, what exactly was the climate that produced that world? To learn how we've come to understand the answer to this question, we have to go back to a German explorer named Heinrich Barth. Between 1850 and 1855, Barth crossed the Sahara by caravan from Tripoli on the Mediterranean coast to Timbuktu on the Niger River. It's one of the great exploratory journeys of the 19th century. Along the way, he became one of the first Europeans to document something baffling in the rocks of the Sahara. Prehistoric paintings and engravings of giraffes, elephants, cattle, and human figures hunting large game with bows and arrows, and all of this in places where, in his era, nothing of the sort existed. In the 1930s, a group of explorers led by László Almásy was ostensibly searching Egypt for another mythic place, the lost city of Zerzura, when they found a stone shelter in the Gilf Kebir. On its walls were prehistoric people swimming. This cave of swimmers existed in a region that was utter desert, and yet the rock art depicted a grassland environment with lakes and abundant wildlife. The implication of these discoveries was almost too strange to absorb at the time. The Earth's largest hot desert, a place the size of the United States, had once been home to a vastly different world. Who carved and painted this rock art? When did giraffes, hippos, and crocodiles inhabit what are now arid wastelands? And what kind of force could possibly cause such massive climatic transformations. It would take many decades for science to assemble the answer. So, with regional variation, sometime around 13,000 to 12,000 BCE, the seasonal monsoon rains of Central Africa began slowly to shift northward, and the Mediterranean precipitation belt slowly shifted a bit southward. As these two systems converged, the desert began to fill with water and life. Rivers began to run, lakes began to form. Grasslands and forests slowly crept over vast expanses of sand. By about 9,600 BC, the era of the Atlantis myth, widespread greening had begun to take hold of major parts of North Africa. Hippos, elephants, crocodiles, giraffes, and fish spread across regions where today they cannot survive, and human beings followed after them. This wet phase lasted with a lot of regional variation until about 3,500 BC. We obviously now call this the African human period, or more popularly, the Green Sahara. So this is one of my favorite images. The hatched area at the bottom is the known range of the African elephant during the historical period. But the white and blue dots show the elephant's earlier prehistoric range, which we now know through the locations of fossils and rock art. This Green Sahara period during the early Holocene was not a freak event or a one-time anomaly. It was the most recent expression of a deep pattern that has been operating on the African continent for an extraordinarily long time. Here you can see at the top the most recent Holocene Green Sahara period above the one that took place during the Eemian period, which was about 120,000 years ago, and may have been actually much stronger and more powerful. So there have been a number of studies which have demonstrated some interesting facts about this. 2019 study used about 250,000 years of dust deposits from sediments off the coast of West Africa to identify this 20,000-year cycle shifting across North Africa between these wet phases and dry phases. A 2013 paper looked at different sediment records that suggest there may have been more than 230 of these Green Sahara periods stretching back over 8 million years. Some scientists believe that this climate change rhythm itself has affected the evolution of our species because the Sahara has been greening and drying in a regular pattern since before the time our human ancestors began walking upright. So what causes this to occur? Well, we've talked about a lot of different science here, so I won't belabor the point, but these are the Milankovitch cycles, and they change how much sunlight reaches the northern hemisphere in summer. They consist of axial tilt, the Earth's distance from the sun, and the precession of the equinoxes, which is this circular shift in the angle of the North Pole over approximately 25,000 years. So when these cycles coincide in a particular way, the effect is that the African monsoon belts strengthen and shift latitude, and the Sahara starts to green. So what may be obvious to you listening here is that if you live on a planet whose largest desert has greened and dried 230 times over 8 million years, driven by the geometry of the solar system, then your idea of what counts as a normal climate becomes a much harder thing to define. Now, back to Atlantis for a moment. If the Green Sahara of 9,600 BCE seems to match the geography of the story, one question that follows is, were there real people living there whose memory, could have reached Plato through ancient oral myths and traditions, even as just a faint shadow across 9,000 years. That seems like a very long time and a slim possibility. Well, we now know that two distinct populations were living across North Africa during the last Green Sahara period, and that they came into contact with each other for the first time because of the massive shift in climate. Linguists and archaeologists have reconstructed their movements by cross-examining the modern distributions of two of Africa's major language families with the ancient waterways that have dried out and no longer exist. These two major populations differed not only in language, but in their ways of life, so much so that some researchers call them the land people and the water people. The water people spoke the language group known as Nilo-Saharan. Its origin was in the east, in the Sudanese Nile River Valley. These were people with a strong aquatic tradition. They hunted fish, crocodiles, hippos, turtles, using harpoons and bone fishhooks. When the Green Sahara opened new lakes and rivers across North Africa, the water people expanded to the northwest along these new waterways. The land people, by contrast, these were savannah hunters who used bows and arrows with what are known as grünen stone points. They spoke the language family known as Niger-Congo, which appears to have originated in northwestern Africa in the area of modern Mauritania. They migrated southeast and eastward across the Sahara during the wet period in pursuit of newly arrived large game. Evidence of their presence spans northern Africa. Archaeologists have lately corroborated these tales that were told by the ancient rock art and the climate data with finds of bone fish hooks and harpoons in the middle of today's Sahara Desert from the water people, and these grünen stone points from the land people. Here you can see the origin points of the two groups. This is the general trend of the migration of the water people during the Green Sahara. And here you have the migration of the land people. Now, here's where this gets interesting. This homeland of the land people, this is the same region which George Serentides identified as being home to the capital city of the mythical Atlantean Empire, Mauritania, near a remarkable ringed geologic feature called the Reshat structure. And just to add a little something here, which isn't in my script for the translators, so Plato's dialogue has about 2 full pages of descriptions of detailed measurements, geometry of these concentric rings that formed the capital city, land, water, about 40 kilometers in width. It's bizarre because it otherwise interrupts the rest of the story. Why is it there? Well, here you have it. This unique natural landform matches up incredibly well with Plato's detailed descriptions of the shape, layout, and size of the capital city of Atlantis. So it's easy to see how what we now know about climate and human migration might suggest that the story of the Atlanteans is a later mythologization of the expansion of the prehistoric land people across North Africa. The timing and direction from Northwest Africa eastward across the Sahara is the same. It corresponds to the account of the Atlantean territorial expansion. Now, I just want to caveat, this does not prove that the Atlantis myth is true, but it raises a possibility that a great human expansion driven by natural climate change at the dawn of the Holocene left an imprint in the oldest layers of human memory. The myth points us to a real place. The real place points us to a real climate. And the real climate has pointed us to a real people whose movements may have been the mythological inspiration for the Atlantis story that Plato eventually adopted and told in his own way. So if there is a seed of truth to the Atlantis myth, then this is where that seed began. The double-edged sword, it sounds ominous. So far, we've seen that confident experts misread Plato for 200 years, and that our confident modern science took 150 years to figure out what ancient Saharan rock art was plainly saying. Perhaps it's the case that our confidence in interpreting a changing climate has been misplaced. This strange journey I just walked you through, from a Platonic myth to the Green Sahara, happened to have the effect of igniting further questions in my mind. 3 in particular. First, what does the evidence from the historical period of written records tell us about how climate change and human civilization affect each other? Second, when the climate changes, what are the measurable effects? Does it bring migration and war? Or, does it bring technological improvement and cultural flowering? Third, does the known solar influence on climate suggest that the sun may also affect us in additional ways that we don't yet understand? To answer the first 2 questions, we're going to start by visiting one of the German-speaking world's great repositories of knowledge, the Vienna Natural History Museum. Among its many exhibits are descriptions of how human civilizations rose and fell along with the climate. Let's take a look. The Bronze Age collapse, roughly 3,200 years ago, was a period of climate disruption across the Mediterranean and Near East. A sharp rise in temperature, followed by a sharp decline in temperature, took place around this time. That drop in temperature is something called a rapid climate change. And this seems to have been caused by frigid polar airflow hitting the eastern Mediterranean, reducing its surface temperature by up to 3 degrees Celsius. Doesn't sound so bad today. This cold snap directly caused drought conditions that affected civilizations ranging from Mycenae to the Middle East, leading to a natural process of deforestation and reduced agricultural yields. The archaeological record shows mass migrations out of drying regions, increasing unrest, and military campaigns that produced upheaval from Central Europe to the Eastern Mediterranean. Kingdoms fell and palaces were destroyed. People retreated to hilltops and fortresses. And yet, at the same moment, we see a shift toward decentralized economies and the rise of metalworking skills that contributed, for example, to the rise of the civilizations of the Iron, Archaic, and Classical ages of Greece. So, was the climate change of 3,200 years ago ultimately a bad thing or a good thing? Let's go back a little further. The first true cities, such as the fortified settlement at Jericho, emerged during the dawn of our current warm period, the Holocene. The shift from nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled city dwellers brought permanent shelter, food storage, and larger populations. But it also brought the first economic class system and a measurable decline in both human stature and health relative to the hunter-gatherers who came before it. It also brought a world in which the concentration of resources had to be defended in increasingly large-scale wars. So, was the founding of the first cities good for humanity or bad? During the exceptionally warm period from about 7,500 to 4,000 BC, agriculture and the domestication of plants spread far across broad regions of Eurasia and Africa. At the same time, the Green Sahara period peaked and began its decline. Broadly speaking, lakes began drying up. Grasslands slowly turned back to sand. Nomadic herding cultures that had lived across the region for thousands of years began to run out of grazing areas. Now, that sounds like a clear catastrophe until you ask where those people went. This is a key place in time where the double-edged sword of climate shows itself, and I owe this particular insight to Dr. Kropelin. The drying of the Eastern Sahara between roughly 4,000 and 3,000 BC forced the peoples of that region to converge on the one consistent source of water that remained to them, the Nile River. And what happened along the Nile during these centuries of convergence forced by drought? A commingling of cultures, religions, and sciences that gave rise to pharaonic Egypt and resulted in some of the most spectacular buildings ever created. The Great Pyramid of Giza, probably completed somewhere around 2600 BC, went on to be the world's tallest building for nearly 4,000 years. So, an event that would, in our own day, surely be reported as a climate catastrophe may have directly produced one of the most enduring and architecturally astonishing civilizations that the human species has ever built. And we can see this same double-edged sword right up into modern times. Let's look at a more recent example. The Dark Ages cooling. You have bad harvests and famines that started during this period, around 400, producing a great migration of nations, and which included the sack of Rome by Alaric's Germanic forces in 410. Bad for the Italians, great for the Germans. How about the modern period? The Little Ice Age, which lasted from roughly the 16th century until the mid-1800s, brought failed harvests across the northern hemisphere and decreased the average height of Europeans by over 2 centimeters. It likely contributed to the collapse of the Ming Dynasty in China. And by the winter of 1788, the coldest in 300 years, failed harvests caused food shortages, riots, and social misery that helped ignite the French Revolution. Bad for the French, and great for the French. So, if we go in the opposite direction, back into deep time, the picture only complicates further. The major shifts in our own species' evolution appear to have taken place across a long cooling cycle punctuated by both rapid increases and rapid decreases in temperature. So I ask you, which is more valuable to humanity? The changes that took place in us 120,000 years ago, or 17,000 years ago, or 12,000, 6,000, or 250 years ago? Each of those marks a transition. Each produced winners and losers. Each produced something we now consider essentially human. It doesn't appear from the evidence that rises or falls in temperature necessarily indicate either benefit or harm to humankind. The cosmos appears to be a great deal more complex than that. So, with our mighty modern scientific apparatus, our satellites, our computer models, our peer-reviewed journals, what is it that we actually understand about how climate and the cosmos beyond it affect humanity? And as we've seen here at this conference, the honest answer appears to be we don't yet understand how much we don't know. Which brings us back to the third question I asked at the start of this section. Might there be forces from the sun itself acting on us that we don't understand and have not yet learned to take seriously? In the first half of the 20th century, a Russian scientist named Alexander Chizevsky proposed an idea that struck many of his contemporaries as being insane. He argued that geomagnetic storms caused by solar activity affecting the Earth's magnetic field affected not only electrical systems, plane crashes, epidemics, and insect infestations, but the human mind itself, and through it, the course of human history. He analyzed sunspot records and compared them to riots, revolutions, and wars in 72 countries over the period from 500 BCE to 1922. And he found that a significant share of what he classified as great historical mass movement events clustered around the peaks of the sunspot cycle. In 1942, Stalin's government became aware of Chizevsky's work, including a paper called The Physical Factors of the Historical Process, and they told him to retract his writings. Why? Because his findings contradicted the official Soviet explanation of why the Russian Revolution of 1917 had occurred. According to Marx, history is driven by class struggle. According to Chizevsky, it might also be driven, in part, by the sun. Chizevsky refused to retract his work. He was arrested and spent the next 8 years in a forced labor gulag. When he was released in 1950, he spent another 8 years undergoing what the Soviets called rehabilitation. After that, he stopped writing about solar cycles, and his theory drifted into obscurity. But it didn't die forever. Over the past 30 years, peer-reviewed research has begun to return to Chizevsky's questions with modern research methods. And some of these new studies suggest that the rhythms of the sun appear to be reflected in the rhythms of the human heart, brain, and the health of the entire body. Other studies have begun to identify, among other surprising things, measurable links between geomagnetic activity and the timing of pandemics. And here we can see a chart showing some examples, such as the 1918 Spanish flu coinciding with the peak of solar cycle 15, 1957 Asian flu, cycle 19, 1968 Hong Kong flu, peak of cycle 20, and the pandemic of 2020 coincided with the absolute minimum of solar cycle 24. So at both extremes of solar activity, there are indications that things happen on Earth that affect our biology. We don't currently understand this mechanism. Some of this research is preliminary, and a lot of it remains very much contested, so we should not jump to conclusions about it. But neither should we do to a new generation of climate and cosmos researchers what Joseph Stalin did to Alexander Chizevsky. Today we've looked at 5 threads from a tapestry of enormous scale: climate, civilization, evolution, the sun, and the human body. We have only just begun to see how they are woven together. And that brings us back at last to Plato. Plato understood in 360 BCE that the world's geography had changed across long stretches of time. He used this knowledge as the backdrop for his myth of Atlantis, setting the story far back in the dimly understood fog of prehistory and Greek mythology, on purpose. One of the things he sought to convey was the arbitrary nature of the historical moment that we live in, the way that traditions, climates, wars, and even the gods people worship could have turned out in other ways if events had unfolded differently. The 19th century translators did not understand this. They missed this aspect of his thinking primarily because they assumed their geography was the same as the ancient world's geography. And as a consequence, the world was misled in part about key elements of the story Plato was actually trying to tell for 150 years. It is only in the past few decades that modern science has begun to grasp just how powerful the transformations of our planet have been and how rapidly they can take place. We are now returning, in a sense, to the kind of awareness that Plato already possessed more than 2,000 years ago. The question is open. Will we also regain some of his wisdom? What this journey taught me is that the truth about how things are interconnected is almost always more complicated than it first appears. We saw this in the work of George Serentitis, a single mistranslated word that hit a continent. We saw it in the drawing of the Sahara, a climate catastrophe that gave birth to pharaonic Egypt. We saw it in the work of Alexander Chizevsky and in a new generation of scientists carefully measuring unseen influences that he first identified 100 years ago. The universe is incredibly complex. I don't believe history suggests that we can accurately predict whether the changes currently happening in our world's climate will ultimately prove to bring good or bad things. Confidence in whatever the human model of reality is has repeatedly embarrassed itself when measured against deep time. What is called for today, perhaps, is something else. A sense of humility in the face of our own ignorance and the limits of the human mind. Plato learned exactly this lesson from his teacher Socrates. In speaking about one of the recognized public experts of his own day, Socrates said, "A certain man appeared to be wise to many other people, and especially to himself. But in truth, he was not. And I thought to myself, I am wiser than this man in this one small thing, for he thinks he knows something and does not. And at least what I do not know, I do not think that I do." So in closing, I leave you with this thought from my years of work on the Atlantis puzzle. Facts are changing all the time. It is only the ability to reason that is timeless. Thank you.